Hello everyone and welcome to our discussion today on work in process. Work in process in Design Manager is an extremely important concept as it applies to your accounting principles throughout Design Manager and your business. Today we will discuss exactly what work in process represents, how it pertains to your financial statements, and how it specifically functions within Design Manager. If you have any questions during the demonstration or webinar today, feel free to enter them into the questions frame on the GoToWebinar panel. Any questions outside the scope of today's topic, please email them to support@designmanager.com. And as usual, we'll be using examples both in Design Manager and Design Manager Professional. And if you'd like to refer to one platform or the other, again, just ask in the questions frame. Let's begin our discussion by defining the concept of work in process. The work in process account is an asset account. If we take a look at our chart of accounts, we can see work in process in our example as listed as the 17100 work in process asset account. Like traditional accounting nomenclature, all assets begin with a 1, as does our work in process account. We can also see our work in process on our balance sheet, as all asset, liability, and equity accounts are displayed on our balance sheet. And there we go. Here is our work in process asset account. In other words, work in process is a value to our company. Unlike income statement accounts, balance sheet accounts do not clear out at the end of the fiscal year, so work in process maintains a balance from one year to the next. You can define your work in process account under your company information window, other accounts. And again, Design Manager comes pre-configured with work in process set to the 17100 account, but if your accounting professional has a different number, you can most certainly change it on the Other Accounts tab of the company information window. That being said, once the work in process account has been initially configured, do not change that account throughout the life cycle of Design Manager without contacting our technical support staff first, as it can have profound effects on your various financial statements, including your balance sheet. In the professional platform, you can access the exact same company information window off of File, Company Information, and there's our other accounts with our work in process account listed under inventory accounts in this case. Exact same concepts behind it in both platforms. So, why is work in process considered an asset? The best way to answer this question is to ask ourselves another question. How does activity get into the work in process account? Well, in accrual accounting, which is the recommended accounting model for interior design firms and the model that Design Manager utilizes, when you record the invoice from your vendor, the cost of the goods and services for the specific project or projects are recorded into the work in process account. The vendor invoice is the physical, fiscal, and conceptual representation of the transfer of ownership of the goods and services from the vendor to your company. With that being said, work in process, or WIP as it's often referred, can be conceptualized as project-related inventory, in that our company actually owns the purchased wares until we ultimately sell them to our clients. Analogous to the vendor invoice representing the transfer of ownership of the products from the vendor to our company, it is the act of creating a client invoice for the goods and services that represent the client taking physical and fiscal possession of those goods. More, and perhaps most importantly, by holding the cost of these goods and services in work in process, we synchronize the accrual of the cost of goods sold and the revenue to the act of creating the client invoice, so we don't have these widely fluctuating net incomes from month to month. For example, if we were not using work in process accounting, we would receive the bills from our vendors and our cost of goods sold would go way up. And those months we'd have negative net income or very reduced net income. And then when we in turn invoice the client a month or months later, we'd have large amounts of revenue with no cost of goods sold. So we'd have huge net income in those months. So rather than having that cycle of negative net income or huge positive net income, by using accrual accounting and work in process accounting in particular, we're synchronizing both the cost of goods sold being accumulated with the revenue at the point of invoicing the client. Now, with that preamble of accounting behind us, let's go ahead and use some examples to demonstrate how work in process actually operates in Design Manager. Let's take a look at our documents in accounting for our Hilson project. We have a purchase order 0002 for Legacy Antiques, and we can see with the status that we have a French dining table and some chairs as well. Now, if we go ahead and receive the bill from Legacy Antiques, which we record with our vendor invoice button, invoice number, put something in here, today's date is just fine, transaction description, final bill for table chairs, and we go ahead and accept or OK our vendor invoice. We've now received or recorded our bill from Legacy Antiques. And what did that just do? We go back and look at our balance sheet, which I've saved on our favorites for convenience today. We can see that our work in process has increased from 4126 to 8326. In other words, as the vendor has invoiced us for the dining room table and the chairs, our company has taken possession of it, and now we actually own that merchandise, and it's an asset of our company, even though it is allocated or predisposed to go to the Hilson project. You can even see on our glossary accounts, work in process, balances that our work in process has increased by that $4,200 that we just recorded. Okay, great. So now we can very easily see how activity gets into the work in process account. Well, how does the cost of the dining room table and chair come out of work in process? Well, as I stated before, upon invoicing the client for those items, the cost will transfer out of work in process. Let's see how that works. Now, if we go and invoice the Hilsons for our dining room table and chairs, let's go ahead and see which ones those are. Whoops. Let's go ahead and invoice items 1 and 2. And there they are. Dining room table, chairs. Today's date is just fine. The date of the client invoice in Design Manager reflects the moment that the cost of the goods would come out of work in process into cost of goods sold. In the professional platform, that would be predicated on the fiscal month of the client invoice. Final bill for table, chairs. Go ahead and print and process our client invoice. There we go. And that's our dining room table and chairs. We'll accept that. And now if we look back at our account balance for our work in process, we can see we've actually reduced that amount by precisely the $3,600 that was in it. And if we look at our balance sheet as well, we'll notice that our WIP has gone back down to 4126. So work in process is an extremely dynamic account in that as we record bills from our vendor, we increase our work in process. As we in turn invoice our clients, we reduce it back down. So great. Our work in process activity has been relieved, but where did the cost of the table and the chair ultimately go? Well, as we invoice the client for the table and chair, the cost moves out of work in process into the appropriate cost of goods sold, or COGS account or accounts. How do we determine which account is the appropriate account? That's an intricate question. So let's review how Design Manager defines the appropriate cost of goods sold account. Which COGS account is determined by the combination of the sales category of the item, the particular component types of the good or service, and if necessary, the company default cost of goods sold account. Let's hop over to the professional platform for a bit, as the mechanics of work in process is the same for each of the platforms. Let's go to our project specifications, and let's continue with our Hilson project as an example. Let's say we're going to make a new custom sofa for the Hilson's Pocono home, and we can see how the sales category, component type, and company default cost of goods sold accounts all interrelate. So if we create a custom sofa, our first step would be our sales category on the item window. The sales category in Design Manager allows us to classify a good or service so that we can answer questions such as how much profit did we make on accessories, or what was the total sales for window treatments for a year? Equally, if not more importantly, the sales categories have a set of sales or revenue and cost of goods sold accounts associated with them. Let's take a look at our furniture sales category as an example. And we can see that for all of our component types, merchandise, freight, crating, etc., we have sales or revenue accounts and cost of goods sold accounts associated with them. So if we classify our sofa, our custom sofa, as furniture, the merchandise will go into the 51,900 furniture cost of goods sold account, while any freight would go into the more generic 59,000 freight cost of goods sold account. So we'll go ahead and say that our custom sofa is furniture. And we'll go ahead. Century is our provider. And let's say that the frame, the sofa itself, begins at 1,800. And let's say that we have some freight at 200. So when we receive the bills from our vendors, from Century, for the cost of the sofa frame, for example, the $1,800 would go ultimately first into WIP, and then upon invoicing the Hilsons, that $1,800 would go into the 51,900 furniture cost of goods sold account, while the $200 of freight would go into the 59,000 freight cost of goods sold account. Now, what if we didn't use a sales category? What would happen next? Well, Design Manager still has to transfer the cost into some COGS account. So in this case, Design Manager is going to refer back to our company information window. Let's look here. On our company information window, cost of goods sold accounts, you can see that Design Manager has a predefined or default set of cost of goods sold accounts. So when we do not use a sales category and we receive the bills from the vendor, if we take our custom sofa as an example, I'm going to default the merchandise into the 51,900 furniture account, while the freight will go into 59,000 freight, etc. Now, this would be fine if our accounting model is very simple and we don't have a lot of specialized cost of goods sold or revenue accounts, and our accounting professional wants to keep a very basic income statement. But if we want to see exactly how much furniture, flooring, lighting, etc. we have bought or sold, we need to use the proper sales categories. For example, if I had a window treatment and I received the bills from my vendor for the window treatment and I neglected to use a sales category, all of those costs would go into furniture cost of goods sold account rather than an appropriate window treatment or Windows cost of goods sold account. One thing we can do, and I often recommend, is to require sales categories to be used for just these purposes, as I want to have my income statement as specific as possible within reason to show where all of my costs and revenues will be going in a given year. So we can use the company information window again under Advanced, General, and there is a Require Sales Category option. This is going to enforce the users when they're inputting specifications to input a sales category. So this will ensure that we are at least categorizing all of our goods and services to help us keep as accurate accounting as possible. And likewise in the Design Manager, Company Settings, Advanced, we have the exact same option as well. And again, I highly recommend doing so, particularly if you have a larger firm, in order to ensure that all of the users are entering in our sales categories to keep our accounting as accurate as possible. For more information on sales categories, be sure to review our past webinars under our knowledge.designmanager.com, which is our brand new help center, and we have a webinars link that you can get to recorded webinars. And in fact, here is the sales categories and general ledger accounts explained webinar that goes into much greater detail on the interrelationship between our sales categories, component types, and general ledger accounts that you can review at any time. Okay. So, how can we quickly determine what particular specifications are currently residing in work in process, for what project they were purchased, and what cost of goods sold account they will ultimately affect upon invoicing the client? This brings us to our work in process report. This is one of the 5 reports that we at Design Manager suggest to be reviewed on a monthly basis at a minimum. For a full discussion on these reports, be sure to view the 5 monthly reports to run and review, again, on our webinars page on our help center at knowledge.designmanager.com. Let's go ahead and take a look at our work in process report. Again, I have saved this to our favorites so I can access it easily. And we'll go ahead and take a look at what are our options here. Notice Design Manager asks, when would you like to have this report run as of? What does that mean? Well, I could run it to see what's in work in process currently, or I could retroactively run the report to see what was in the account as of the end of the year. Very convenient for tax purposes, as your accounting professional may want to see a lot of the information as of the end of last fiscal year. We can also narrow the report down by entering in a project range. In other words, what's in work in process for a particular project or projects? In other words, what haven't I invoiced the client for goods and services that I've already purchased? We can optionally subtotal by the project or by the future cost of goods sold account and each project within the account. We can show the full description of the specifications, and then we can even show the revisions. This makes the report a little bit longer, but what it does will show each of the individual steps that show why a particular specification has come into or out of work in process. Let's go ahead and take a look at the report. And there it is. And I've kept our examples pretty limited, yet with still a lot of information that we can use as examples. And if we look down, we're grouping it, again, in our case, by the particular project, which I find very convenient. So we list the project, the accounts that's going to be affected upon invoicing the particular specifications, their reference number, brief description, the transaction of the supplier or vendor invoice that put the specification into work in process, the vendor invoice number, vendor invoice date, purchase order number if applicable, the component type, merchandise, freight, design fee, crating, etc., and the total cost. That's in work in process. And ideally, our work in process report should always match the work in process account for the same period. And as you can see, our work in process on our balance sheet as of the end of this month is $41.26, as is the total of our work in process report. Why is the work in process report so important? Well, one, and very importantly, are you invoicing your clients properly? For example, maybe we got a 100% deposit on some merchandise. The client paid us in full, but we have never actually created the invoice for those goods. Even if the invoice itself had a balance due of 0, it's a necessary process in order to move that cost out of work in process into cost of goods sold and do some other things like alleviate the deposit, accrue sales tax, etc. So we don't want to inadvertently miss invoicing. Another example, maybe there are 2 items created inadvertently in a project for the same physical merchandise, say a group of chairs. One of these items I actually used to invoice the client, while the other one is the item that I processed my purchase order on and recorded my vendor invoice. So now I need to make a client invoice on the purchase order item in order to process those costs of goods sold through. Otherwise, I'd be overstating my net income because I have the revenue from the item to which I invoice the client, and I'll have all of our costs sitting in work in process. So if we think of our balance of our income statement, we'd have all sales or revenue and no corresponding cost of goods sold to balance it out. So we're overstating our net income. What does that mean? It means we're going to be paying a higher income tax on it as well. So along with the pre-billing report in Design Manager, the work in process report is a very important tool to monitor our proper invoicing to the client. Let's take a look at some of our projects specifically. So if we look at the Hilson Pocono home, we've got our sofa, chair, bar stools. All of these are pretty recent, back in early December, and we simply have not yet invoiced the Hilsons for that merchandise as they have not received it yet. Fantastic. Those will all drop out of work in process naturally when we do invoice them. The Carter's Brigantine Beach home, the wall treatment, that's fantastic. It's not installed yet, so again, I want to maintain that in my work in process account. So the merchandise for the wall treatment and the freight, again, will both drop naturally. But this restocking fee. The restocking fee was for some fabric for pillows that came in after we invoiced the Carter for those pillows, and they had changes to the fabric. So we need to make an invoice for the restocking fee in order to get recompensed. Let's do so and see how it affects our work in process report. Slide that over. Go to Documents and Accounting. Go down to the Carters. We're going to be invoicing item 3. And here it is. Here's our item for our pillows. So we can see we did indeed invoice them in full in the past, but now I've got that $35 from the restocking fee that I also want to be recompensated for. Today's date is just fine. Transaction description. As many of you know, I'm a big advocate of the transaction description, as I find it an invaluable tool when I go to research information that I may have entered in months or even years prior. This does not appear in the client invoice, though. It's only for our reference. Plug in bill for restocking fee. And now we're going to be charging the Carters for the restocking fee plus a little markup in sales tax. Use our modern format. And there we go. If we accept, We now have our invoice listed as of today's date, and if we reprint our work in process report, notice that the restocking fee has dropped. So naturally, as we invoice our clients for the items in work in process, they drop right off the report, all the while maintaining the synchronization of the total work in process on the WIP report with our balance sheet. Let's take a look at, get some of these out of here. Let's take a look at the Carter's Pennington home. This project has a few issues. One, I don't want to charge the Carters for the rush charge for the interlining. It's not their fault. It's something we're simply going to absorb. But I still do need to move that $55 of freight out of work in process into cost of goods sold. So even if we're not charging the client, we still need to make the invoice to move it out of work in process. How do we do that? Let's see. So let's go back to Documents and Accounting. Go to Carter's Pennington home in this case. Make an invoice. Here's item 16. We've already invoiced the vast majority of it, but we still have that $55 that's sitting in our work in process that we want to move forward. So I'm going to select our item, which in this case is a window treatment. I'm going to use the override. I'm going to use the override function to tell Design Manager, listen, thank you for appropriately telling me that I want to invoice that restocking, that rush charge, but I am going to override that to 0. In other words, I'm going to create an invoice with no balance due. And we can see our invoice price goes down to 0. We're in override mode. I definitely like to use a transaction description in this case. Invoice to move cost to COGS or something along those lines, so I know what I was intending if I review this information in the future. Select our window treatment, and notice, very important, down at the bottom, no price to the Carters, no sales tax, no deposit, etc. Basically a 0 balance due invoice that is just being used as a mechanism to move the cost into cost of goods sold from WIP. Go ahead and print and accept our invoice. And if we look back at our work in process report, we can see we have now dropped our rush charge off of our Carter's Pennington home. So frequently we get questions at our technical support lines asking, hey, I need to get an item out of work in process. The procedure is always the same. We need to make an invoice for it. Regardless of whether or not we're going to be actually billing the client for that good or service, we always need to process a client invoice in order to push the costs from work in process into cost of goods sold. Now, let's take a look at the other item in our Carter's Pennington home. And I can tell this is a stone table that I returned to the vendor and actually received a refund on this, and the original client invoice had been credited. But why is this still in work in process if I process a refund from the vendor? Let's move over to Professional Platform for this one, and we're going to review a new report, our work in process history report. Very similar to the work in process report, the history shows us particular transactions when we're focusing on a set of items or even a particular project to see why certain things are or are not in work in process. So we can look at the Carter's project, and we're going to focus in on that particular stone table using the item range. And there we go. Now we can see, very similar to our work in process report, all of the information, project reference number, account, transaction, etc. But right beneath it, we have a very detailed chronology of why and how this particular piece is in work in process. You can see that we made a new vendor invoice. It was removed out of work in process by client invoice 10,004. It's reopened by the credit client invoice. Now it's sitting in work in process, but I don't see why my vendor refund, for example, is not being reflected. So the work in process history gives me another layer of detail to review our WIP. Further, let's go into project and specifications and see if we can track down what happened. So if we pull up our Carter project, here is our stone table. I'm going to first look at the item status, which is going to show all my client invoice information. And I can see that I indeed invoiced it back in December and credited it last month on 1/16. If I look at the component window for order status, this is going to show my vendor invoice information. I can see that we paid for it. We took our refund with a little bit of cost. I see the issue. One common pitfall in work in process, particularly with refunds, is the order in which things are done. In the case of our stone table, we recorded the vendor invoice, processed the client invoice, and then as the client returned the goods, we went through the refund mechanism a little bit out of order. The rule of thumb is whenever we're backing out transactions, we want to do them in the reverse order. So if we made our vendor invoice first, as is commonly the case, then we invoice the client, we would then want to go in reverse order to back out those transactions. So then we want to credit the client invoice and then credit or void the vendor invoice. Otherwise, we may have activity left in work in process. How do we clear the item? We know that we need to move it forward and get that cost of goods out of work in process to reflect our true cost. Same exact mechanism in professional. Go to accounting, client invoices, add an invoice, go to our Carters. Here is our stone table, and just like in Design Manager, we're going to move cost to cost of goods sold, highlight the stone table, use the override function, override, make our price to invoice and taxable amount 0, and upon selecting or tagging the stone table, ensure that all of our balances and prices, sales tax, etc. are 0, and then print and post the invoice. Again, forcing the appropriate cost of goods sold out of work in process into COGS. So, as part of those 5 reports that I mentioned, work in process is extremely important to monitor on a timely basis. 1, you want to make sure that we're invoicing our clients appropriately. 2, we want to make sure that we're moving that cost out of work in process. There could be activity that should be in our cost of goods sold, which would give us a much more accurate indication of our net income, that we need to move forward. Again, if we have costs in work in process rather than cost of goods sold, that's going to equal inflated net income. Inflated net income equals inflated income tax that we'll be paying in April. Okay. Lastly, let's take a look at how we can skip or bypass costs going through work in process. First, when we're recording our bills from our vendors, we can manually tell Design Manager to bypass or skip the work in process procedure. So in professional, let's say I am adding, how about a freight charge, or even a vendor invoice. If we select an invoice for one of our purchase orders, let's take the freight, for example. I want to ensure that when I record this, that my freight is not going to be inadvertently resting in work in process. Perhaps I'm going to be not charging the Hilsons for the freight for the French dining table. I use the Edit button. On my vendor invoice distribution window, there's an option to bypass work in process. If I set that manually, Upon creating this vendor invoice and recording it in Design Manager, that $200 for the freight will not go into work in process. It'll go right into the $59,000 freight cost of goods sold account. Another option, very important, say we have some additional expenses, or what Design Manager calls project-related operating expenses, freight, any kind of services, or restocking, those sort of things that we want to charge back to the project in order to maintain accurate profitability, but we know that we're not going to invoice the client for such charges. So under our expense bill miscellaneous, and if we're doing a project-related charge, there's the option to bypass work in process right here as well. So again, this is very handy. If we know we're not going to be invoicing the Hilsons, the Carters, etc., for a particular freight charge, a shipping charge, creating those sort of things, but I do want to tie that cost back to the project, I can use the bypass work in process to hit the appropriate COGS account immediately and yet still maintain a very accurate cost figure on the project themselves. And over in Design Manager, same functionality. In fact, that bypass work in process is a very intelligent little option. For example, Design Manager will automatically set it if it realizes that the item has already been invoiced to the client. Let's take a look at, how about an invoice for the Carter's Pennington home. Now I know that item 1 has been invoiced to the client. And say I get an additional freight charge, or an extra shipping charge comes in well after I've invoiced the Carters. If I go ahead and enter that freight charge in, notice Design Manager has already detected that I've invoiced the Carters for the particular item. And it's going to say, listen, by default, I'm going to jump right into cost of goods sold so we don't mishapenly keep that additional charge stuck in work in process. We can still certainly invoice the client for that additional charge, but this way, Design Manager is really helping out to ensure that you're pushing the cost or the activity directly into cost of goods sold. So you always have control over that bypass work in process option, and it'll really help you when you're thinking about entering these bills, whether or not to utilize it in those certain circumstances. Again, though, by default, we do want everything processing normally through work in process. That being said, we can actually tell Design Manager to not use work in process for a particular project. Now this would be very rare and should only be used in cases when you know you will not be invoicing the client on an item-to-by-item basis, such as a model home perhaps, where it would be invoiced at full completion as a particular contract, or even in phases or something along those lines. This way, by configuring the project in this manner, all the cost from all invoices recorded go directly into cost of goods sold, and we'll simply invoice the client on our contractual obligation. How do we do so? If we edit our project, defaults, advanced, again putting this in a very specialized area, there is an option to bypass work in process. What this ultimately does is that each item, now for the Carters, if we create a new item, we can see it's already set to bypass work in process. So as we create every new item, Design Manager will be bypassing the work in process. And the exact same is available in Professional, of course, as well. Under Projects, edit the project, defaults, advanced, and there's our bypass work in process. Again, should be used in only particular circumstances and is definitely the exception, not the norm. So if you're ever in doubt, feel free to contact us at support@designmanager.com to get our opinion on that. And that even shows us another option. We can individually set particular items to bypass work in process, and this might be more common. Let's say that we want to consolidate all the shipping charges for the Carter's Pennington home onto a single item. But we've actually blended the cost of that freight into our overall markup on all the other items. So we're not going to be tracking it on an item-by-item basis. So I could make an item for shipping charges. I could set it to bypass work in process. And as all the bills come in, I can attach or join them to this particular item, so I'm reflecting the actual cost into the Carter's Pennington home while simultaneously ensuring that I don't have that activity residing in work in process, but rather going directly into my $59,000 freight cost of goods sold account. So that's a common option as well. If you know that you'll be recording bills from the vendor for an item, but have no intention on charging the client, you can manually set it to bypass work in process, and you'll keep yourself ahead of your work in process reconciliation that you should be get done again on a monthly basis or so. So, in conclusion, for today's webinar, work in process is an important foundation of accrual accounting, in that it synchronizes the increase in COGS and revenue for the reselling of goods and services to the point of invoicing the client. We discussed the concept of work in process in depth and how it applies in a practical manner in Design Manager. We reviewed the very important work in process report and the work in process history reports to further help us analyze items that may or may not be in work in process. We also discussed mechanisms for removing items from work in process, even if we do not plan on charging the client for those goods and services. And we even discussed manners where you can tell Design Manager when to skip or bypass work in process functionality in general with the bypass whip setting. So with that being said, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on our discussion on work in process today. Don't forget, this webinar will be available shortly on our webinars link on our help center at knowledge.designmanager.com. Any questions or thoughts, comments?